Well, look, it's a real pleasure for me to welcome Brenda Stevenson to deliver tonight's Prothero Lecture. I'm Emma Griffin, I'm the President of the Royal Historical Society, and I'm really very delighted to have you all here in person to listen to our lecture. The Prothero Lecture is one of the high points in the Society's annual calendar. It was first given in 1969 and is named for George W. Prothero, who was born in 1848 and died in 1922. He's a historian and government official who served as the Society's president between 1901 and 1905. Since 1969, the RHS Prothero Lectures have captured the chronological and geographical breadth of our discipline, from lecturers including, amongst many, many others, Joanna Burke, Linda Colley, Olwyn Houghton, Sujit Sivasandaram, Keith Thomas, and Natalie Zeman-Davis. So tonight it's my particular pleasure to welcome Professor Brenda E. Stevenson as this year's RHS Prothero Lecturer. Brenda is an internationally recognised scholar of race, gender, slavery, family, and racial conflict. Since 2021, she has been the inaugural Hillary Rodham Clinton Professor of Women's History at the University of Oxford. And she is also the Nicol Family Endowed Chair in the Department of History and Professor of African American Studies at UCLA. Brenda's work ranges widely in the history of the Southern United States and African American history, from the colonial period through to the late 20th century. Her many publications include the books Life in Black and White, Family and Community in the Slave South, The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Justice, Gender and the Origins of the LA Riots, and What is Slavery? Her writing has gained Brenda numerous awards and prizes, far too many to enumerate here, but a very, very distinguished career. And amongst other public accolades, they include her recent appointment by President Biden to serve on the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Review Board in the United States. Brenda's most recent book, What Sorrows Labour in My Parents' Breast, is a history of the enslaved Black family in North America, and it was published in April this year. I'm very pleased to say that everybody attending can get a 30% discount on the book. We have flyers here and outside at the main hall, which you can use to purchase her book. In tonight's lecture, Brenda will be developing themes from this book as she speaks to the topic To Do and Be Undone, Enslaved, Black Life, Courtship and Marriage in the Antebellum South. So please join me in welcoming Brenda Stevenson to give tonight's RHS Prothero Lecture.
Thank you all very much for coming and spending your Wednesday afternoon with me. I really appreciate it. I just want to say that it's quite an honor to be here with you all. It's the Royal Historical Society, and I have to let you all know that the only reason why I'm still in England instead of going back last month was to give this lecture, because last year I was asked to do it and I had already gone back to LA for the summer, and so I said, no, we're staying this time. I have to give it this time. So thank you all for coming out, and thank you, Emily, so much for getting everything arranged, and also Philip, my parking and all other things. Thank you very, very much. I also would like to thank God from whom all my blessings come. So I'm going to begin, and I'm going to be talking about a chapter of the book that deals specifically with courtship and marriage. And unfortunately, I have some slides, but I don't have enough. I mean, I wanted to send more, but now you can only send a very few through email, and so I wasn't clever enough to use Box or Share or whatever it is. But at any rate, we'll struggle on with these few visual images that I do have. Okay, so Henry Walton Bibb believed that he would not marry and begin his own family until he had gained his freedom. It was not that family was insignificant to him. Kinship lay at the crux of his social identity. Still, as much as a spouse, children, and other kin could offer in the way of comfort and support in the bleakest moments of enslavement, Henry knew from the time that he was a child in Catalonia, Kentucky, that family could be a heavy cross to bear if you were unfree. Born in 1851, Henry grew up in the matrifocal family, deeply loving his mother, Mildred Jackson, and having an abiding affection for his 6 younger brothers. His love and commitment and their reciprocity, however, did not eliminate the inevitability of pain, loss, mystery, anger, and frustration that was integral to the enslaved kinship reality. Henry Bibb knew, as most Black captives, that the notion that a quote-unquote paternalistic slaveholder would recognize or protect a slave's family ties was a cruel lie. What white man, Henry wondered, was his own father? Who were the white fathers of his siblings? His mother had told Henry that his father was a local planter by the name of James Bibb, but the boy still grew up with, quote, no personal knowledge of him, end of quote. His brothers, also the children of local white men, had no known connection with their paternal kin, legal, emotional, or material. While not entirely true, Henry lamented, quote, it is almost impossible for slaves to give a correct account of their male parentage, end of quote. Certainly true, though, is that bondspersons who were conceived as a result of coerced sexual encounters and breeding schemes, or lost their fathers through sale or death before they could form a clear sense of them, found that contemplating their paternal ancestor resulted in an unyielding mystery, and sometimes outright deception, bitterness, and shame. Henry decided early in life that he did not want to become a, quote, lost husband, or one of those fathers hustled away from his children at the drop of an auctioneer's gavel. He wanted more for himself and for those whom he loved. There were, of course, several other good reasons to resist becoming an enslaved husband, father, wife, or mother. While some aspects of enslaved family life changed over time, many of the menacing conditions always threatening to pull the rug out from under family in the 17th and 18th centuries persisted and even became more exaggerated during the antebellum years. An enslaved child's early loss of one's kin as a result of rental, sale, inheritance, or death was an experience that Henry Bibb understood only too well. The first time I was separated from my mother, he wrote on the very first page of his autobiographical account, quote, I was young and small. His owner's practice of hiring him out lasted for the next, quote, 8 or 10 years in succession. This division, Bibb went on to explain, was a fundamental condition of his enslavement. Quote, it was then my sorrows and suffering commenced. It was then I first commenced seeing and feeling that I was a wretched slave, end of quote. One can well imagine the feelings that Bibb's mother had at the early loss of her son and her inability to continue to protect and nurture him, or the anxiety, upset, and loss his younger brothers, or even boyhood friends suffered when he was rented out away from them. The litany of common abuses, including physical and sexual brutality, grinding poverty, a routine lack of adequate food, clothing, housing, furnishings, and medical attention, laid the foundation for Black captives' lifelong traumas, physical disabilities, rage, depression, and anxiety. Even as a child, Henry explained, he was, quote, compelled to work under the lash without wages and often clothes enough to hide my nakedness. I often worked without half enough to eat. I have often laid my wearied limbs down at night upon a dirt floor or a bench without any covering, end of quote. Without attentive kin to intercede, material and working conditions were even more harrowing. Henry labored, quote, through all kinds of weather, hot or cold, wet or dry, without any shoes until winter. He recalled of his solitary suffering and frustration, quote, no arm to protect me from tyrants' aggression, no parents to cheer me when laden with grief, end of quote. Henry Bibb's devised remedy was to escape, and he did not believe he could do so with a wife and children in tow. Henry began a career of fugitivity when he was just 10 years old, at that time trying to evade an abusive slave mistress who daily scolded, flogged, and pulled his ears. He continued his short-term escapes for the next several years, each attempt deepening his determination and skills necessary to gain a permanent freedom. Only then, Henry believed, could he have a family of his own design. As an adolescent, Henry's romantic interest in sexual arousal proved to be fierce competition to his determination to find freedom before marrying. After some failed attempts to win the affections of enslaved women he found physically attractive, Henry met Melinda. His notations about their courtship and early marriage provide an intimate view to the social and romantic experiences, as well as to the family lives, concerns, and commitments of young enslaved men and women during Henry's generation and beyond. Quote, "The circumstances of my courtship and marriage," he explained, quote, "I consider to be among the most remarkable events of my life while a slave," end of quote. Remarkable, he was quick to add, because, quote, "the fascinating charms of a female had caused him to temporarily focus on something other than freedom." Bibb recalled that, quote, "the first 2 or 3 visits that I paid this dear girl, I had no intention of courting or marrying her, for I was aware that such a step would greatly obstruct my way to the land of liberty. But he soon found himself recklessly," and I'm quoting here, "deeply in love," end of quote, and came to understand that Melinda, who resided on a plantation some 4 miles away from where he worked, felt similarly about him. Love, indeed romantic love, Bibb soon discovered once he began to court Melinda, was a kind of miraculous emotional respite from some of the hardships of his enslaved life, even if slavery always would be a clear threat to his love. Nothing seemed to be able to curb his growing affection for the beautiful Melinda. Henry perceived Melinda's love for him through, quote, "her warm reception, affectionate shake of the hand, gentle smile, and even her willingness to oppose her mother's wishes that she marry someone else." Henry insisted that Melinda consent to 2 promises before they married: that she would not interfere with his commitment to be a faithful Christian, and that they would escape to Canada together as soon as possible. Quote, "I never will give my heart nor hand to any girl in marriage," Henry insisted, "until I first know her sentiments upon all important subjects of religion and liberty." To his delight, Melinda not only agreed, but readily confessed that she felt likewise. Both promised to live pious lives while they courted one another before marriage. Their proposed marriage drew the opposition of Henry's master, as well as the couple's close kin relations. These are important revelations because they open a window into the emotional struggles enslaved families and communities underwent when their young people fell in love. Henry's mother believed that at only 19, her son was too young to marry, and assuming such a commitment would bring him greater difficulty than he already was experiencing. Melinda's mother, who had gained her freedom from her daughter's white father, wanted Melinda to marry someone who lived closer to her. She had hoped that Melinda would marry the biracial son of a wealthy planter who too might someday gain his freedom from his father. This proposed son-in-law, she reasoned, could do more to help her daughter than a man like Henry, who had no such possible options. Henry's master, Albert Sibley, disapproved of the couple's intentions because he did not want his captive involved in an abroad marriage, fearing the groom's new marital responsibilities would tempt him to, quote, "steal to help support his wife." Melinda's master, William Gatewood, approved of the marriage. He would, after all, benefit from his ownership of any children Melinda birthed. A stable marriage, even an abroad one as Henry's and Melinda's would have been, would reap new property, quote unquote, for him over the next several years. Despite the swirl of doubts, objections, and lingering fears, Henry and Melinda did marry in 1833. Their Christmas-time nuptials signified a typical marriage date for enslaved men and women because it meant that with the holiday schedule of released work time and additional leniency to travel locally to connect with friends and family, the couple could begin their married lives more leisurely and with communal support. Henry recalled that their wedding celebration was a happy occasion. Quote, "We had quite a festival given us. All appeared to be wide awake, and we had quite a jolly time at my wedding party," end of quote. Perhaps their celebration was similar to that captured in 1838 by, if you see here, by Christian Mayer in his painting called Kitchen Ball. Bibb described it as a time of, quote, "sweet remembrance and pleasure," end of quote. He believed that his marriage, albeit without legality, was sanctioned by God, and that his marital bed was, quote, undefiled, end of quote. Henry complimented his wife on her living up to his and other husbands' expectations. Their first months were a happy time. Quote, "She was with me in sorrow and in joy," Henry remembered, in fasting and feasting, in trial and persecution, in sickness and health, in sunshine and in shade, end of quote. They still, however, were enslaved. It did not take Henry long to regret that he and Melinda had spent precious time enjoying each other and their community after their marriage, rather than immediately escaping to Canada. The pain and insecurities of slave marriage soon imposed themselves on Henry and Melinda. Henry's master decided to move his slaveholding operation further west to Missouri, threatening the couple's abroad marriage with a permanent separation. After what must have been several weeks of grave anxiety, Sibley sold Henry to a relative who resided about 7 miles from Melinda. Bibb, like abroad husbands, could only visit her once a week, from Saturday evening until the beginning of work on Monday morning. Henry's new owner, however, then sold him to Melinda's owner for $850, fearing that if he did not do so, Henry would escape. Bibb's closer proximity to his wife, however, created new frustrations and sadness. The pain of watching her being, quote, shamefully scourged and abused, end of quote, without any recourse. His emotional struggle, and certainly Melinda's, deepened after the birth of their daughter, Mary Frances. And then we have some images here. This is an image of Henry Bibb much later once he escapes from being enslaved and takes on an occupation as an editor of a newspaper. These are some illustrations from his autobiographical account here that you see. Mary Frances's enslavement caused her parents tremendous psychological trauma. Melinda's work largely was confined to the fields, and there was no person left to care for their child. Mary Frances spent her days in the home of their mistress, a woman who did not hesitate to hit the child whenever it pleased her. Henry noted that he had known Mrs. Gatewood to, quote, slap with her hand the face of little Frances for crying after her mother until her little face was left black and blue, end of quote. Once Mrs. Gatewood's handprint was visible on the very light-skinned child's face for more than a week after her mistress had beaten her. Who can imagine, Bibb wrote, for the generations of enslaved parents who came before him and after, quote, what could be the feeling of a father and mother when looking upon their infant child whipped and tortured with impunity, and they placed in a situation where they could afford it no protection? Henry was determined to free himself and his family, even though he realized the risk of being caught meant permanent separation by their being sold further away from him. He tried multiple times. Sometimes people helped him, other times they betrayed him for money. Henry reached the Free States more than once and even got as far as Canada, but he was never able to do so with Melinda and Mary Frances. He repeatedly attempted to retrieve them, but failed each time. His successful escapes were interspersed with captures that, although painful, temporarily reunited Henry with his wife and child. Eventually, their slaveholders sold all three. Henry's mother, with other kin and friends, came to the Louisville, Kentucky slave market to bid a tearful goodbye. Madison Garrison, a long-distance slave trader, bought Bibb, Melinda, and little Mary Frances as part of a parcel that he was gathering to sell in New Orleans. The three suffered terribly waiting in prison. Garrison separated the spouses, and the prison conditions were horrific, a veritable, as in Henry's words, hell of chained, ragged, dirty, sometimes violent, nearly starved white and black captives. Even more alarming, Garrison, the slave seller, had decided to use Melinda as his sex slave until he sold her. Her refusal to oblige him meant daily whippings and the threat that he would sell Mary Frances, their child, away from both parents. Henry was aware of Garrison's actions, but chained within the prison, unable to help either his wife or daughter. His autobiographical account leaves his readers to conclude what Garrison, quote unquote, did with Melinda when he removed her from their prison for 3 weeks before she, Mary Frances, and Henry were reunited in the coffle headed south. In New Orleans, Francis Whitfield, a cotton planter from Claiborne Parish on the Red River, of Louisiana, bought the Bibb family for $2,200. When Henry first met Whitfield, a purported deacon in the Baptist church, he believed that he would not be such a difficult master. He was terribly mistaken. Life for the Bibb family, although they now lived together, still was very difficult. Whitfield soon proved to be a brute. He punished any resistance with a harsh whipping. Henry witnessed Whitfield's demand that a young female become his son's sex slave, whipped her until she complied, and publicly gave 200 lashings to another enslaved female who had displeased her mistress. All of his captives had to work long and hard hours, received only minimal food and clothing, had to give complete obedience, even to his sexual demands, or face backlashings followed by saltwater washings. Henry and Melinda worked primarily as domestics, but Henry took particular note of how badly Whitfield treated field workers and their families. Mothers had to leave their small children under trees or in the weeds while they worked, since Whitfield would not let them return to the quarters to nurse their babies. These infants and toddlers always were in danger of being bitten by snakes, eaten by alligators, burned by the scorching sun, or ravaged by mosquitoes or other insects. Mothers, fathers, their children, and other kin suffered from fatigue, malnutrition, and ineffective medical treatments. Melinda and their second child both were the victims of untreated illnesses. The baby died, and Henry buried it, quote, without even a box to put it in. Throughout, Henry remained a devout Christian, and undoubtedly Melinda did as well, but even their faith was a source of distress, since their owner would not allow them to attend religious meetings. Facing a staked lashing for doing just that, or an expansive number of other offenses, he and Melinda debated the merits of Henry escaping. Melinda feared that if he ran away and was caught, that he would be sold away, and she had no other kin nearby from whom she could seek aid or solace. Quote, "This was truly heart-rending to my poor wife," Bibb explained. "The thought of our being torn apart in a strange land after having been sold away from all her friends and relations was more than she could bear." Still, he persisted. Henry initially escaped on one of his owner's mules to avoid tracking by bloodhounds, but he could not bear leaving his wife and child behind. The following day, he returned and decided to take Melinda and Mary Frances with him, believing that if they escaped together and were caught, that their owner, who had bought them as a family, might sell them as a family too. The three escaped to an uninhabited island on the Red River. And these were places that people often escaped to, and that were maroon societies also existed on. Some days later, they were violently captured by slave hunters with bloodhounds. Their greatest fear was realized. Henry survived his brutal whipping, but he was sold away from Melinda and Mary Frances. Unfortunately, Melinda's, I just want to make sure I'm on the right page. Okay. Unfortunately, Melinda Bibb's tragic story remains spoken only through Henry's words. I'm on the wrong page. Right. The couple begged Whitfield to keep them together, but their captor's only response was a whipping in their terrified child's presence. He then sold Henry to gamblers who agreed to try to unite the family, but Whitfield refused to sell Melinda and little Mary Frances. Henry eventually was sold to a Cherokee master, but managed to escape when his slaveholder died. Sometime after reaching freedom in Detroit, he learned that Whitfield had sold Melinda and Mary Frances to another man who took Melinda as his concubine. She was, Henry bitterly admitted, living, quote, in a state of adultery, end of quote. Now, in 1847, Henry married again. This time, he married Mary Elizabeth Miles, an abolitionist and Massachusetts State Normal School trained teacher who was the daughter of free Black Quakers. And that's how he, becomes this Henry Bibb that we see here. Okay. Comparing his new marital state with his former, that is married to a free woman versus an enslaved woman, the self-emancipated Bibb reiterated the problems incumbent in slave marriage and from his perspective as a husband in having an enslaved wife. Mary, his free spouse, Henry elaborated, quote, is a bosom friend, a helpmeet, a loving companion in all the social, moral, and religious relations of life. She is to me what a poor slave's wife can never be, for she cannot be true to her husband contrary to the will of her master. She can neither be pure nor virtuous. Mary and Henry moved to Windsor, Ontario, with Henry to avoid him being re-enslaved after the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. There the two were actively involved in the Underground Railroad and published a newspaper, the first by African Americans in Canada. It was appropriately titled, quote, The Voice of the Fugitive. Unfortunately, Melinda Bibb's tragic story remains spoken only through Henry's words. And we can be certain, however, that Melinda, too, was forever horrified by the devastating losses of her husband, birth relations, and extended family, and of her dreams of freedom for herself and her daughter. We must remember that it was Melinda, after all, who lessened her chances for gaining freedom and remaining close to her kin of birth when she married Henry. She must have deeply regretted, perhaps even fiercely resented, the marriage, given Henry's inability to keep his promise to her, and undoubtedly her family, that he would help her and their children to gain liberation. It was Melinda who had to live with the painful consequences of humiliation, shame, and desperation of being forced out of a marriage to a man whom she loved and into sexual slavery with another. What became of Bibb's daughter is uncertain, but Melinda also likely had to witness Mary Frances' traumas for some years to come. The family life that Henry Bibb had with Melinda resonates with much of what I've repeatedly found regarding kinship ideals, heteronormative marriage, and familial relations, and the difficulties of Africans and African-descended peoples enslaved in the Americas from the early colonial period forward. But heterosexuality was not their only reality. Single-sex relationships, both romantic and fictive kin inclusive, certainly existed even if they remained hidden or practically invisible, given legal and customary hostility centered on homoerotic practices. The evidence, however, emerges bit by bit. For example, it was recently uncovered that Pierce Lafayette, when the quote-unquote property of Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, was known to have a quote-unquote Negro mistress, another enslaved man named Felix Hall. After the Civil War, Lafayette became part of a fictive kinship of quote-unquote queens in Washington, D.C. Many had been born in slavery. As freed people, they routinely met, danced, dressed extravagantly as women, and loved each other romantically, sexually, and familially, strongly indicating that same-sex love lives, the same-sex love lives that they always pursued, even while enslaved. Henry and Melinda Bibb's domestic life, like that of Pierce Lafayette and Felix Hall, played out during the Antebellum era, a period when the nation's demographic, economic, political, and cultural forces affected Black family life with somewhat different emphasis than in earlier generations. The remainder of the talk I will talk about this evening talks about these experiences in the decades before the Civil War. More slaveholders permitted marriage and encouraged sexual relations among enslaved people during the antebellum era than earlier periods because of their desires to increase their slave property through sustained procreation, given that the Atlantic slave trade had ended in 1807, for example, or 1808. For some, the domestic slave trade was to be a lucrative business from which they could benefit from selling, quote unquote, breeders and enslaved people not needed to work on their agricultural estates. Quote, they would have 2 or 3 women on the plantation that was good breeders, and they would have children pretty regularly for freedom come. Josephine Bacchus of South Carolina, formerly enslaved in South Carolina, explained. The assumed fecundity of a given female or male enhanced their monetary values, particularly the female's antebellum market price. As Peter Brown, a Mississippi, noted regarding his mother's relatively good treatment, quote, they prized fast breeders. They would come to see her and bring her things then. She had 10 children, 3 pairs of twins, end of quote. Willie McCullough of Marion, South Carolina, described the way enslaved females were valued. Quote, some of the slave women were looked upon by the slave owners as a stock raiser looks upon his brood sows. If a slave woman had children fast, she was considered very valuable. End of quote. John Adams' mother was 17 when she married his father, then 18, in Frederick County, Virginia. Their owners undoubtedly were pleased with the couple's fertility. They had 23 children, including 4 sets of twins. Alice Sewell of Alabama recalled that her grandmother's master, quote, swapped her because she did not, quote, bear children like they wanted her to, a decision he came to regret more and more. She bore 13 children at her new residence. Not surprisingly, owners with some members of the enslaved community, along with some members of the slave community, looked on a woman who did not or could not bear children as unworthy of marriage. As former captive Pierce Cody pointed out about couples in his vicinity, quote, all marriage unions were permanent and a barren wife was considered the only real cause for separation, end of quote. Barry Clay confirmed that it was his experience that captors were eager for their captives to marry as soon as they, quote, manifest interest in the opposite sex, end of quote. Slaveholders only rarely took their captors' wishes into consideration, demanding that they, quote unquote, be fruitful. A barren woman, Clay continued, was separated from her husband and usually sold away. Some slaveholders promoted high birth rates among their slave property through marriage, even if they refused to view black marriage as a legally binding contract or to guarantee that a woman, man, or man could choose their own spouse or keep and raise children whom they bore. Lulu Wilson from Kentucky was clear about her mistress's intentions regarding her fertility and how she manipulated the young teen to comply to her breeding schemes. First, by offering Lulu a beautiful wedding, otherwise unobtainable. Quote, Mrs. told me I had ought to marry and promised a white dress and a wedding dinner when she did so. Lulu married a man belonging to her captor's nephew. Then came the pressure for her to bear children. The local physician was complicit, boldly lying to Lulu about the medical consequences of not having children. Quote, I know it weren't long after that when Mrs. Hodges got a doctor to see me, Lulu explained. The doctor told me less than I had a baby, old as I was and married, I'd start in on spasms. So it wasn't long till I had a baby, end of quote. A generation earlier, the Hodges family also had pressured Lulu's mother to marry and bear children. After Lulu was born, her mother did not have any additional children. Her owners decided that it was the fault of her husband. Quote, they say my pa am too old and wore out for breeding, Lulu testified, quote, and wants her to take up with this here young buck, end of quote. They purportedly, quote, ran Lulu's father away, end of quote, and her mother had many additional children with the new man they chose for her. The white folks, Lulu concluded, wanted slaves, quote, to breed like livestock. So this image, from 1850 on the screen, demonstrates quite clearly that mistresses, as indicated by Lulu and others, could be insistent that their husbands, on these, quote, arranged marriages. The drawing depicts an enslaved woman being forced, on pain of a whipping, to marry the man her mistress had chosen for her. None of the witnesses, neither black nor white, dared to interfere. And I'll stand back so you can see the image here. And this woman is making this couple marry, jumping the broom. As you can see here, you can see other people looking on too. Antebellum enslavers not only used racial science to pair females and males according to the physical traits they desired in slave offspring, but also according to what they believed were the natural, quote unquote, intellectual or skilled capacities of their bound workers. Men and women were angered by the lack of control they could exercise in choosing a spouse. Sarah Ford of Texas recalled that, quote, the white folks don't let the slaves that works in the fields marry none. They just puts a man and breeding woman together like mules. If the woman don't like the man, it don't make no difference. She better go or they gives her a hiding. Willie McCullough's grandmother and mother assured him that neither were allowed to choose their husbands, but rather were treated callously as breeders. Quote, "Mother told me that when she became a woman at the age of 16 years, her master, Billy Cannon, went to the slave owner nearby and got her a 6-foot man, almost an entire stranger to her, and told her she must marry him. Her master read a paper to them, told them that they were man and wife, and told this Negro he could take her to a certain cabin and go to bed." End of quote. Neither man asked her for her consent. Willie added that his grandmother, who was enslaved on an adjoining plantation, quote, said that several different men were put to her just about the same as if she had been a cow or a sow, end of quote. Jacob Manson of North Carolina testified regarding the slave breeding schemes he witnessed. According to him, quote, "A lot of the slave owners had certain strong, healthy slave men to serve the slave women. Generally, they give one man 4 women, and that man better not have nothing to do with any other woman, and the woman better not have nothing to do with another man," end of quote. Hillard Yellerly, also from North Carolina, concurred. He explained that when a girl became a woman, that is of the earliest childbearing age, she was required to, quote, "marry and begin to have children. Captors," he noted, "obliged even girls as young as 12 years old to do so." Quote, "Masters would sometimes go and get a large, hale-hearted Negro man from some plantations to go with his Negro woman. He would ask the other master to let this man come over to his place to go to his slave girls. Negro men 6 feet tall went to some of these children," end of quote. Some masters violated close kin marriage taboos that enslaved people believed important to maintain. Quote, "My husband told me that in slavery, if your master told you to live with your brother, you had to live with him," Francis Bridges of Texas recalled. Quote, "My father's mother and dad was first cousins," end of quotes. Others refused to let husbands and wives be sexually exclusive to one another. Male and female slaveholders involved in breeding sometimes forced married slave men to have sexual relations with women other than their wives. Some men also had more than one wife, or at least had the appearance of multiple spouses because of their forced physical separation from wives, or because, for some, it was a cultural preference, even in the antebellum decades. Although the practices of polygamy was greater during the 18th century, when the largest number of enslaved Africans arrived in North America and brought marital practice directly from their original cultures, polygamy was not extinct by the antebellum era. At Pierce Butler's Georgia plantation, for example, Francis Kimball recalled meeting Judy, who had 2 children by Joe. The same Joe had another wife called Mary at the Rice Island plantation. Abroad marriages not only were frowned on because of the additional freedom it gave men who requested passes to visit their wives and families who lived elsewhere, but also because these husbands' children, like the man Robert who wanted to marry Isabella Bonfrey, who was Sojourner Truth, of course, would belong to their wives' masters. Some owners of females also denied permission for these women to marry men abroad because of the likelihood that consistent childbirth was reduced if husbands did not reside with wives and could visit only occasionally. I'm going to talk a few minutes now about actual courtship. Despite these abuses, teens and adult males and females sought romance. One former antebellum bondswoman named Ari remarked that when she was 15 or 16 years old, she was, quote, "was big enough to be looking at boys and them looking at me," end of quote. Their best opportunities to find someone to share their emotional and sexual desires occurred on their time off, particularly at Saturday night, Sunday, and of course during the longer work weeks during the Christmas holidays. Dances, frolics, communal quilting bees, storytelling times, corn shuckings, and even prayer meetings were the backdrop or cover to courtship. Lizzie Farmer of Texas mentioned some activities she enjoyed, even remembering a song that they sang. Quote, "We would have dances and play parties. We had ring plays centered on romance, had, lost, and began again, a cycle that many enslaved people and others as well experienced. We'd all catch hands and march around, then we'd drop our hands, except our partners, and we'd swing around and sing, You steal my partner and I steal yours, Miss Mary Jane. My true love's gone away, Miss Mary Jane. Steal all around and don't slight none, Miss Mary Jane. He's lost out, but I's got one, Miss Mary Jane. End of the quote of the song. Wade Owens of Opelika, Alabama, likewise recalled fun times in the quarters of the nearby woods. Quote, when they had them Saturday night frolics and dance all night long as nearly day when hit was going, my daddy picked the banjo. At the corn shuckings, they sing all around the corn pile, Sally, and they had whiskey and gin, end of quote. Sarah Cole could reminisce that on Saturday nights, a show had it, cutting monkey shines and dancing all night long sometimes. Nellie Lord of South Carolina spoke of the popular flat-foot dance when a person would, quote, slam his foot down, flat down on the floor. The wooden-bottom shoes would make a loud noise, end of quote. Males often brought small gifts of candy, the spoils of their hunts, nuts, fruit, scarves, or ribbons to their sweethearts. Ari remembered with great sentiment that Franklin Benz would ride miles to see her when they were courting and, quote, brought her candy and nice things to eat, even though she refused to tell him that she would marry him until her parents agreed. There also was plenty of alcohol on hand at courting parties, quote, on Saturday nights, us would frolic and dance all night long if you wanted to. Buck dance, 16-hand reel, and cakewalk. They would blow reed quills and have all the liquor they wanted. On them corn shuckings, shuck corn, drink and holler all night long, Frank Minifree recalled. The next day, Sunday church meetings also gave young couples the opportunity to meet and spend time with each other in the company of their friends and families, and sometimes alone. So too did revivals. Religion and recreation went hand in hand, especially at baptism time in the swimming hole. Everybody fetched a big basket of drug, and sakes alive, Sidney noted, such another dinner you never seed, all spread out on the grassy grove by the old graveyard. Beauty mattered in the courtship game. Girls dressed and adorned themselves prettily, while men wore their best when they expected or hoped for romance. Martin Richardson of Kentucky was so taken by a young woman's beauty that eventually he agreed to help her to escape. At first, Martin refused the request, quote, but then I saw the girl and she was such a pretty little thing, brown-skinned and kind of rosy, and looking as scared as I was feeling, so it wasn't long before he decided to help her. Neil Upson of Georgia recalled Abraham, a domestic, who was so determined to appeal that he even stole his master's shoes to wear to a party. The shoes were too tight and his master found him out, but Abraham was the highlight of the party, attracting most of the young women who attended. It seemed to Neil that no one wanted to dance with the other men there who did not sport such a sartorial luxury. Lucinda Jordan of Alabama explained that she and her friends picked hickory nuts, strummed them together into necklaces, and, quote, smiled at our fellers when they were courting. Molly Dawson of Texas remembered the charm strings that females wore that was, quote, supposed to bring good luck to the owner of it. They would collect buttons and beads from their friends and kinfolk to place on their strings, some as long as 5 feet. Molly believed that the necklaces were some of the prettiest I ever seen, much more beautiful than those store-bought ones. Women also made and applied natural dyes along with their skills and fashion fantasies to make and remake brightly colored dresses. Excuse me. Courtship not only meant singing and dancing on Saturday nights during the holidays and at corn shuckings time or church dinners. It also often included physical and sexual intimacy. Some families or communities pressured females, not males, to remain virginal until marriage. If an gal went wrong, Frank Minifree of Alabama noted of the extremes taken in his enslaved community, quote, they beat her nearly to death, end of quote. Despite such testimonies, the absence of a virgin status, for whatever reason, however, did not seem to deter most antebellum enslaved men or women when they chose their spouses. What little evidence that does exist regarding biological anomalies, however, indicates that women who did not have distinctly female sexual organs, but who identified as female, faced the rejection of their male suitors. Josie Martin of Arkansas, for one, explained that, quote, she wasn't popular with men because she was intersex. Little information also has been found regarding genital surgeries that might have inhibited sexual contact or pleasure. Female genital surgeries and clitorectomy certainly were part of a female's ritual initiation into womanhood in several of the ethnic groups from which enslaved captives were taken. And a state inventory of Nicholas Haydel of Louisiana, for example, noted in 1822 that there was present a, quote, young negress of 14 who was, quote unquote, mutilated. It is not certain what was meant by mutilation, but a young slave woman's fertility, which European Americans would have believed to have been potentially harmed by genital surgeries, was such an intrinsic part of her value that such a notation would be warranted when the estate's worth was being determined. Some courting men and women readily deferred to familial authority when it came to romance and marriage, but others were not shy about making their feelings known to potential suitors or husbands. When one rice worker along the coast of South Carolina asked Elizabeth Bottoum to have her write letters to her boyfriend who had run away during the Civil War, she directed Bottoum to describe her feelings to him coyly. She says, you must talk stiff, but kinda easy too. He was not yet her husband, and she did not want him to think that she had the upper hand in their relationships before they had wed. He should know that she only, quote, remembers him sometimes, end of quote. Another woman was more forthcoming. She wanted Bottoum to assure her love interest that he was still the center of her attention. And I love these ideas and the way in which they are expressed. She said, tell him I can't forget him, and I expect him cannot forget me. I stand just where he left me, and I shall stand there till he gets back. And if he never comes back, I shall still stand there as long as I live. Imagine. One more woman wanted her lover to know that she, quote, would give her eyes to see him again. Someone else requested that the teacher write of her passion for her love interest, quote, I eat you and I drink you, end of quote. Somebody's gonna put that in a rap. Okay. Asking that another woman in their presence leave before she made her request to the letter write, Susanna asked Bottoum to set one of her students straight. She did not want him, okay? The letter, she instructed, should begin with the greeting, sir, because Susanna wanted him to understand that she did not even consider him a friend. She also needed him to know that he had erred when he had not appropriately acknowledged her self-worth, and she had no intention of lowering herself to his estimation. She was, Susanna assured him, quote, an apple high up on the top of the branch of the tree, out of his reach. He cannot reach me, she reiterated, even, quote, if he jump and jump till he jump his head off, end of quote. Indeed, not every man was able to secure the woman he wanted to marry, not only because of enslaver interference, but also because of a woman's refusal. Lunsford Lane of North Carolina was so disappointed when his first great love was not available that it was another 2 or 3 years before he changed his resolve that, quote, he should never marry. Porter Scales, also of North Carolina, had been trying to court, quote, Betsy Ann Housegal of Mrs. Nancy Watkins Webster, but he was cut off by another man, end of quote. And before Henry Bibb met his wife, Melinda, he tried to gain the romantic attention of 2 other females by seeking the advice of conjurers who guaranteed that their methods would be successful. One instructed Henry to touch his intended lover with the dried bone of a bullfrog. Another conjurer insisted that he had to wear the lock of a girl's hair in his shoe for a certain amount of time. Neither ploy worked, surprise, surprise. Instead, both young women responded with anger, not surprising responses given that Henry carried on both escapades without their permission. The second young woman was especially angry after he forcefully pulled a lock of her hair out of her head, end of quote. Courtship signified the exchange of affection and getting to know one another, as well as coming to terms with the loved one's families, communities, social worlds, and perceived obligations. Culturally prescribed gender roles largely determine expectations of sexual and emotional loyalties, prospects of dedicated time and attention, and anticipation of good behavior after nuptials. Isaac Lane of Tennessee boasted that his chosen bride was, quote, a young woman of 18 years who had attracted considerable attention because of her industry, modesty, neatness in dress, and ladylike bearing, end of quote. Gifts as indicators of a growing affection also were welcome. Females hoped that their male companions would donate material and monetary support when they could do so. One frustrated male suitor responded to his lover's demand for money that he already had sent her $2, even though, quote, he has no money for myself. I had, however, money for you whenever you asked. She, in turn, reminded him that her expectation of financial support was not all she required. Respect was requisite. He was quick to respond, you treat me as a gentleman, I will treat you as a lady, end of quote. Molly Dawson recalls some of the questions that were asked by one slaveholder to couples who required his permission to wed. His queries indicate that this owners expected within the boundaries of slave system etiquette, traditional gendered behavior of married couples, the male patriarch or provider, and the female as obedient, loving wife and mother. After finding out the man's preference for the woman by asking, you likes Nancy and wants to marry her, he then inquired of Mose, will you work for her and bring food to her? If the man answered affirmatively, he would then ask the woman if she will obey Mo and love him and raise his children. Many enslavers may not have been interested in spouses having as a lady and spouses behaving as lady and gentleman towards each other, but they strongly opposed marriage between couples whose behavior might prove disruptive in the quarters or to their work routines. Lunsford Lane, who initially had an abroad wife, explained that when he asked her master's approval for their marriage, he had only two conditions, that Lunsford behave himself and make her behave herself, end of quote. That captor, as many others, expected the enslaved man to act the patriarch in his marital relationship. Lunsford assented to both, knowing full well that this delegated power over his wife did not breach the control that her or his enslaver had over their married property. One formerly enslaved man from Kentucky bitterly recalled a driver who had been compelled by his captor to, quote, severely whip his wife for stealing food. Her wounds from his beating contributed to her death, end of quote. I'm going to talk just briefly now about marriage rituals, and then I'm going to close and open up for questions and comments. Antebellum bonds people's marital rituals, some simple, some elaborate, some seemingly ridiculous to outsiders, reiterated the control that captors were determined to maintain, even in the face of steadfast resistance. Charles Grandy's memories are instructive. His enslaver's creation of a wedding vow for him and his quote-unquote bride was just as insulting to Grandy's sense of what a marriage ritual should be as the master's casual choice of a wife for him. According to Grandy, the woman purchased from the trader, quote, would get off the wagon and his master would lead you both to his cabin and stand you on the porch. He wouldn't go in. He'd say something from the Bible and finish up with this. That's your wife, that's your husband. As your master, she your missus, you're married, end of quote. Lizzie Jones in Texas recalled that her owner would allow enslaved men and women to romance one another, but they could not marry until they were 20 years old. He would give them his permission, but there was no ceremony. Quote, slaves weren't married by no good book or the law, neither, she explained. They just take up with each other and go to the big house and ask master to let them marry. If they was old enough, he'd say to the boy, take her and go on home. Alabama house slave Matilda Pugh Daniel, however, clearly was proud of the wedding that she and her betrothed Joe had in their owner's parlor, officiated by General Hunter, an elder in his mistress's family. Elizabeth Keckley's Missouri wedding, quote, was a great event in the family. The ceremony took place in the parlor, in the presence of the family and a number of guests. The day was a happy one. While Elizabeth's nuptials were officiated by Bishop Hawkes, who had married her captor's children, the use of the broom as a ritual object that signified marriage between enslaved women and men was perhaps the most prevalent form of antebellum marriage ceremony, or at least the most remembered. Quote, me and Julie jumped over the broom in front of master and us was married. That was all there was to it, Robert Shepard from Georgia noted. That was the way most of the slave folks got married them days. The marriage ceremony was simple, Elmo still added. They used branches from bushes or from brooms, and one of these brooms was laid across the floor, and the boy and the girl run and jump over it, and they was married. Quote, end of quote. My aunt married up at the big house, and they give her a big dance. They had a fiddle and had a great time. They just jumped over the broom to marry, Jim Gilliard of Alabama confirmed. Not everyone jumped the broom in the same manner, and even those who did ritualize the common household object ascribed different meanings to it. The ritual of jumping the broom, and I know a lot of people do this at their weddings, but the ritual of jumping the broom has not been found in African traditions, but rather among Anglo-Saxon and Western European and pre-Christian marriage and divorce rituals, and later in the 19th century to indicate a sexual union not recognized as marriage. And I've written other places about this, so I won't go into any detail here about it. Not only did Exeter and Tempe of North Carolina jump the broom, they also were the recipients of an exceptional slave wedding and reception, a clear indication of Tempe's favored status in her captor's home. As the bride described it, she was dressed all in white, dress, shoes, long gloves, and a veil her mistress made out of a window curtain. Someone even played the wedding march on the Herndon's family piano to accompany the couple as they walked down the aisle. Tempe and Exeter then kneeled before an altar that Mrs. Herndon, the mistress, had decorated herself with candles and roses, while Uncle Edmund Kirby, the plantation's black preacher, performed the ceremony. Afterwards, there was a reception of barbecued shoat, ice white wedding cake, liquor, and dancing. One Edgefield, South Carolina resident even commemorated the ritual of slave marriage in an artistic form as a scene on a stoneware water jug, capturing the ornate marriage rituals and costumes. The bride's clothing is distinguished by a necklace, while the groom is wearing a suit and has a top hat, as you can see here. The artist captures the couples toasting one another. The jug also has symbols of the couple's future domestic life in the form of an image of a pig and a jug itself. The back of the stoneware piece included a large leaf wreath image, another symbol of blissful home life. And I'm going to stop here, okay? And you have a sense of what I'm saying and what the chapter is like in the book. There's much more about the difficulties that they had and how some marriages ended by the choice of the people themselves, not just by slave owners, etc. But thank you all for listening so patiently to me, and I'll take questions or comments. And I also want to say that this is the book, okay? And it's from Roman and Littlefield. And one of the things I wanted to do with the book was to really just get the voices of those people enslaved out. I wanted people to hear what they said, what they thought, what were the kinds of conditions that they fought against, what were the kinds of ones that they acquiesced to, etc. And I also wanted to talk for the book to actually speak to what I call the Black Archive, which is the voices of the enslaved themselves. Because there is a lot of discussion these days about the silence of the archive and the violence in the archive, which is certainly true. But I also wanted people to understand that enslaved people did work really hard to retain memories of their families. They worked extremely hard to retain memories of their grandmothers, great-grandmothers, etc. And Black archivists at the beginning of the 20th century, like Carter G. Woodson, for example, worked very, very hard to accumulate these archival materials. And you find lots of materials, for example, in the libraries of the historic Black colleges, the HBCUs, etc. And so I think it's important for us to understand the problems with the archive, but also to use it and to continue to expose what's in the archives of those places that people don't typically go to look for this material, which are in those kinds of libraries. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. An amazing paper. And
Thank you.
Amazing taking stuff that's obviously very familiar to us, family and relationships is all very familiar and part of our ordinary life, and then putting it into a context that's very unfamiliar and very jarring for us. It's very, very difficult listening at some points and very thought-provoking. And I know there'll be people in the room. I've certainly got questions of my own, but it's not my moment to speak to Brenda. We've got a roving mic, and because we are recording it, just that's first question. Just wait to get the mic, and then we can pick up your question. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Stevenson, for really kind of compelling and compassionate lecture. My name is Joanna Brown. I'm a PhD student in creative writing at Royal Holloway. And in your closing remarks, actually, you began to answer the question that I was formulating, but it really was about you've really brought those voices to life so sort of vividly. I think that's one of the most compelling aspects of the presentation, was hearing people's testimony in their own words. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about some of that source material, especially obviously sort of after sort of the Henry Bibb story that you were telling. I imagine much of which would have come from his autobiographical writing. But in terms of like the sort of courtships and those relationships, and we're getting those snippets of people's voices, are we talking about kind of like testimonies that were taken either during that sort of, was it the Federal Writers Project, or was it a range of source material that gave you access to those voices?
Well, thank you for that question. The Henry Bibb is from his autobiographical account, okay? And it's a very rich account. It's very, filled. He did gain his literacy, so he's able to have some control of what is said, and he can read what's been written and all of that. I'm a little bit miffed with Henry Bibb. I don't know if you could tell or not, because he just decided, his life changes dramatically and miraculously, really. And then, he has to say, oh, my wife could never be, she was awful. She could not be loyal to me and these kinds of things. And I thought, well, dude, okay, you basically left her. You decide, okay, I've tried this several times. It's not working. I'm going to keep booking this time, okay? And so, and he marries into this well-off free Black family, and life becomes wonderful to a certain extent. Of course, he's got these horrible traumas and things that he has to continue to deal with, but he seems to have forgotten that this person's left, and she's been sold as a concubine, and perhaps her daughter, who is, a quadroon or octoroon, will be sold as a concubine as well. And, what must she feel? If she had only known that he had gone off and married somebody else and been happy and, started a newspaper, et cetera, she probably would have been pissed. I know I would have been, but anyway, so that's his autobiographical account. Some of them are from the WPA narratives from the 1930s. Some of them are also from that time period. Like, there's some things from the first book I edited was the Charlotte Fortin Diaries, and so she's writing during the time period, and she's writing about these relationships, and she's writing about their weddings and what they looked like and what they wore and all of that. And then the Bow Tomb is from that same time period, which is the early 1860s, and these are women who are now, quote unquote, contraband of war. And so they're talking about their relationships with men who have gone off to war, who have been, who have run away or something like that. And so they're both from the time period in which they are being experienced, as well as in later time periods as well. And one of the things I think is really important is the absolute important significance of orality within the Black community, and how stories are passed from one generation to the other. Descriptions are passed. The dedication my book is dedicated to, and I'll read it to you, is dedicated to, for the African girl sold from Virginia to South Carolina and all her kin. And that was a story of my maternal ancestor that I got from my mother, who told us, and she grew up on the plantation where her family had been enslaved because they now owned some of that land themselves. And so she made sure to just tell us repeatedly, the stories from the last generations of enslaved people in her family. But the first generation was this African girl that had been sold from Virginia to South Carolina. So that just inspired me to continue to look for stories that people have within their families, because that is the archive that we have to seek out. That's the archive that we have to find, and we have to record, and that we have to leave for other people as well. Oh, you're welcome.
Moving indeed.
Thank you.
I just wonder whether we have any accounts in reverse from the captors, the slave owners, these deeply Christian people. Have you got any sources for them at all? What do they say, if anything at all?
Well, that's an excellent question. The first book, my first monograph, Life in Black and White, Family and Community in the Slave South, actually is about, half of the book is about white families, and half of the book is about their enslaved people. And so I have looked really carefully at literally thousands of letters that enslavers have written about their families primarily. They don't talk a lot about enslaved people, except for if they are deeply sick, if they run away, if they've just been purchased, those kinds of things. And so, but even in those archival sources, you do find material about, enslaved people, because sometimes they recall conversations that they had with them, particularly if it's something in which is confrontational, etc., or if the person asks them for something which seems unusual to them. There's also, I think, really compelling information in the letters, not the letters so much, but the wills, of enslavers. So because oftentimes they talk about family connections, that is, they're going to give away this particular woman and these children, and they list the names of the children, etc. If in my first book, I was really blessed to have, of course, George Washington's 3 slave list, because I was writing about that part of Virginia, in which he lists family groupings. Okay, and so many people, not all of them, and certainly not most of them, but many people do list family groupings among their enslaved people. Even those persons who have small numbers of enslaved people versus those people who have 300, like, George Washington and his wife. And so you can see the family connections. And because he had 3 slave lists, you can see them over the generations, too. And that adds a lot to it. And then you have people like, Fitzhugh or the Carters or whatever, who leave very long, detailed letters about, their slave property and stuff. And so you can really see various things like medical treatments, for example, the kinds of illnesses that they had, whether or not they escaped, whether or not a child perished from what kinds of medical treatments they had, whether or not they were Christians, the kinds of stories that they told, the kind of language that they use, etc. So there is a lot of material found in those documents. Of course, they're found in a different voice, from a different perspective, and you really have to try to understand that perspective and understand that voice and what it really means. You have to try to, quote unquote, translate it in some kind of way or another. But there is a lot that's there. And they're in the, quote unquote, traditional archives. They are in the state libraries, they're in the state historical societies, they're in the local, historical societies. And they're also in the autobiographical accounts of these people, as you see in Mary Chestnut's diaries, for example. They're in their autobiographical accounts, and there are lots of them in wills, in their wills in particular, wills and last testaments, in their family Bibles, and also in the court records from when something spectacular happened and it has to go to court.
Thank you. That was an amazing lecture. Thank you very much, and touched on so many points that are still relevant to our communities today, which is distressing in itself. I'm Dr. Vanda Popolska. I'm a fellow and also previous chief executive of the Society of Genealogists.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
Now CEO of the Black Equity Organisation, so hoping to merge those things in a conference later this year. My question, in a sense, really is that I know when I was carrying out my research on witchcraft trials that it's an incredible amount of emotional labour to go through these accounts. And whilst it's a wonderful thing to honour those voices that have been lost, that is an incredible emotional labour, and how much more of that is when we're considering the past that affects us. You've talked about directly, as I'm starting to do now with my own family history and Black history. So really my question is, as historians, we are, emotionally rigid in a sense when we're looking at the sources. But how do you protect yourself from that real overwhelm of emotion? Because we feel it, we know it's our people, it's not distant, it's our past.
Yeah, no, it's very hard to do so. And the older I get, the harder it is. When you're in graduate school, you really don't care. I mean, to a certain extent, you read this like, oh, that's interesting. It's very interesting. I need to finish writing this dissertation, period. I need to get through this. As you get older, though, especially after you have your own children, you have your own marriage and all of that, and you go back over the material, and it's devastating to read, these kinds of things. And I remember when I was little, no, not when I was little, but when I was in my teen years, my mother telling me about her grandfather. Her grandfather was a slave child. Right, but he gained his freedom at the general emancipation when he was like 7 or 8 years old. And she had asked her mother why her grandfather it seemed so angry and it was so mean, And she said her grandmother told her, well, he was a slave boy. And the master was his father. And the master, forced himself on his mother and would beat her if she refused. And his job was to actually wash her down in the salt water. So when I said the salt washes, I mean, that's not the quote that's not from my family, but it's something that happened repeatedly. And he said he could never forget that screams, his mother screaming and crying and, his father, not caring and all of this other kind of stuff. And so from an early time period, then those stories of my family in slavery I've had. And I think that's helped to contextualize it for me because I kind of knew what I was in for, having heard it much of my life myself and traveling to South Carolina and being on that land and seeing the slave, graveyard and all that other kind of stuff. And I have pictures of my great-grandfathers who were both enslaved. And so, but it is really, really, really hard, especially when you get to the things about the children, because the children they just have they just find it so difficult. And of course, 40% of them died before they were 10 years old. But the ones who survived are just looking forward to a life of being sold repeatedly. By the time we get to 1840 or so, people are being born are being sold 5 to 7 times during their lives. So that, the chance to have a family just keeps disappearing on them. So it's a lot of emotional labor. I think it's emotional labor for anyone who's reading it too. It's not just the people who are the absolute descendants. I remember reading Knight, for example, about the Holocaust. I thought, oh my goodness. Let me go read some slave narratives, So, you just get, these are things that are just devastating, no matter who's writing it, no matter who's experienced it. I try to get my students prepared for it by letting them know that, slavery has existed for a very long time. It's, from the ancient society forward, the different kinds of enslavement, but at the end of the day, you don't have control over who you are, what you do, what you eat, where you live, those kinds of things. And so while they can, not so that they can find comfort in that, but just so knowing it's just not the burden of Black people, or whatever. It's almost every group of people who exist today have been touched by enslavement of some form or another. I had this example, for example, of Henry Bibb, who became this enslaved person of a Cherokee, slaveholder at the time. And so, his experiences under this man weren't any different from anybody else's that he had been enslaved with, but it just opens up your sense to how many people and groups of people and kinds of people were invested in in enslavement in the U.S. and around the world. Yeah.
Thank you. Quite a few questions. Somebody up in the far corner. Another person there, and we've got somebody here. We've got about 50 minutes. Do you want to? Okay. Well, maybe try the person a bit closer first of all, and then you can make your way over after to the far corner. And then we'll come down to you.
Hi, Dr. Stevenson. Thank you so much for your talk. And thank you more broadly for years of your contributions to the field of slavery studies. It's been central to my work. And, you've made an undeniable mark on the field already, and so I'm very excited for this new work.
Thank you.
So my name is Zaria. I'm a second-year PhD student and the former advisee of Dr. Dinah Ramey Berry.
Oh my gosh, you're my grandchild.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh, bravo.
Yes. So I have two questions. One is, where do you see this work departing from your earlier work? You mentioned life in black and white, but also work on the slave family that happened around that time, like Blasingame's book on the slave community. Obviously, you're very attentive to the dynamic lives of women, and that's one way you depart from so much other scholarship on the slave family during that time. So that's question one. And question two is, I noticed that when you describe Black love, it is disruptive to the logics of the plantation, in that enslaved people could use the travel between plantations as opportunities to run away. So disruptive, but it's also productive in that the increase of that union serves plantation economic interests. So I'm wondering how you balance the two as you're going through the narrative. And a specific example is, you mentioned jumping the broom was celebrated, yet in the image of jumping the broom from Virginia that you showed, the young lady looks distraught as the mistress gestures to the broom that they must jump over. So there's this interesting balance between love and capital interest that I'd love to hear you talk about.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, her advisor was my student, and that's why I say she's my grandchild. Okay, just to be clear about that. I don't have any grandchildren. I'm old. I'm not that old. Okay, so, but anyway, let me just begin by saying that this book is very different from my book in Life in Black and White, because that book really focused on one area of Virginia. It was a local study. And so it was looking at Loudoun County, which is northern Piedmont, and then a little bit southern Piedmont too. This book looks at the entire of the United States and so it not only looks at that part that was part of the British Empire, but also the French and the Spanish Empire, and for a short period of time, the Dutch Empire. That book really starts in about 1730 or so and goes to 1860. This book really starts in Western and Western Central Africa in the 16th century and goes through the Civil War period, okay? That book is divided between white families, one half of it, and black families, the other half of it. And then with the black families, there's half of that section is enslaved families and the other is free black families, okay? So this book is only on enslaved families, period. So this is a much bigger book in terms of the scope of it than that book was. Okay, so that's that. How does my work fit into the kind of historiography that you speak to? Well, you mentioned John Blasingame's slave community. He was my advisor at Yale. Okay, so the only reason why I went to Yale, it's a great university, but the reason why I went to Yale was to work with him specifically. Okay, and so he arranged this topic for me. I didn't want to write on this topic, but I wanted to write on enslaved women specifically. And I tell this story all the time, and it's true that I'm having a meeting with him. He hands me a little piece of paper. I opened up the piece of paper and it says Southern families. And I said, what is this? And he says, this is your dissertation topic. And I thought, oh, no. No, I don't want to do that. But I couldn't say that, so I was just sitting there blinking, trying not to cry, and so it did take me about a year to wrap my mind around, writing on families instead of specifically on women. But it's a topic that stuck with me, as you can see. The difference between my work in the first book and Blasingame's work, if we look at slave testimony, and I didn't know this was going to happen, but I did find out that indeed slave families did not mimic or were not precisely like white families. They were not necessarily nuclear families. They were certainly not patriarchally driven families, even though, men have some power that women don't have within those families. They were not, monogamous marriage families, et cetera. They were much more likely to have matrifocal households and to have extended families versus nuclear families, et cetera. And so that was called post-revisionist is what it was called, because Blasingame and Genovese and Gutman and all those people, Deborah White, were called revisionists. And then my work came out, it's called post-revisionist. So it differed from their work in that kind of way. And then I also think that in terms of my work today and where it fits in with what's going on now, is that people are looking at very specific things that go on in the family, or they're looking at slightly different topics. For example, Dinah's latest book, is about pricing of enslaved people, and external pricing and internal pricing. Okay, what enslaved people thought was their value versus what people who are buying them and selling them and stuff thought their value were. I wanted to do something that was pretty comprehensive, that began early, covered the whole period, ended late. And I wanted to do that focus on what I call the Black archive, which are sources that come primarily from Black people. So that's other works that you look at, like Marissa Fuentes' book, for example, which is magnificent, or the woman from, I'm forgetting her name for a moment, but Johnson from Johns Hopkins, her work, and they are looking specifically at how the archive is violent and it's silent and all these other kinds of things, which is great. But I'm interested in looking at other archival materials and then going back to those silenced archives and trying to milk as much as I can from them too. So I think that's where my work kind of falls. It's great to meet you, by the way. That's wonderful. Did you know Dinah at Texas? Oh, okay, right. All right, wonderful. I was there before she was. I was. She took the job that I abandoned 20 years earlier. They couldn't get anybody else in between, but that's Texas. I won't go any further. Yes.
We're almost out of time.
But
what we'll do, exactly, we'll just scoop up the two questions together. So if you want to ask, and then if you could bring the microphone down here, and then I'll hear both of them, and you can pick whatever you want to respond to in our closing
great.
moments.
Thank you.
Mine's a very brief question. I'm just curious about that pot. The one
I know.
Yeah. Because I suspect, and you may have done research on it, it reminds me of a Greek amphora from the 5th century BC. It's black. It looks like black figure, the style of where the man is standing.
Uh-huh.
He got some straight out of an archaeological museum, and the shape is like an amphora. So
Right.
I think the artist may have had some knowledge of archaeology. I'm
Maybe
just thinking.
so, but
If you
okay.
don't
So I found this in the museum. What's the name of that museum in Atlanta? The High Museum, right, in Atlanta. And this artist did work on Black lives. So, he was known to have done work on, depicting Black life in particular. And so it may have been in some ways, in terms of our artistic depiction of it, he may have been trained, to know classical works and, statuary and things like that. But as well as vases, but we do know that this is a depiction of a Black life, okay? And we know that just because of the other work that he does, but also as we can see the way in which the woman is dressed, for example, the way in which the man his face is almost as you would see in blackface in a way, to a certain extent that we see later on, and also because the pig, which means it's it's indicative of domestic life in the South during the time period, etc. But I was amazed to find it. It was, you had quilts, and then you had this, and you had some other materials as well. And so, and he comes from a place where there is a pottery, which is in the Piedmont part of Georgia, and where Black people were potters as well, although this is not by a Black person. Mm-hmm. And you had a question?
I do. So I'm not an historian, but whilst I was listening to it, and it's nearly unbearable, even though I hear about it as an aspect of it every day.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about reparations, and I was thinking about repercussions, and I'm wondering, am I being fanciful when I think there's a connection between then and now? There's still this connection. Is this what you have found, or is this what you believe, or do you think we're talking about two very different times, two very different situations and explanations?
Well, I think that there's definitely a connection between the two, and so the present. I wrote the book because I wrote the book because I felt like people didn't really understand the Black family, and the Black family continues to be depicted as being dysfunctional, and continues to be depicted as being not only dysfunctional but harmful to the children in the family, harmful to the broader society. As a result of that, the Black people are not good citizens, and the Black people don't deserve to be treated equally, in the law or in society in particular. I'm talking about the United States, okay? So I'm not capable of speaking about other societies, present contemporary societies at any rate, and so I wanted people to see where, how the Black family got to where it is, but also to understand that the Black family has always been a resource for Black people and has always been a resource for the society in which they live. In terms of, it was these families who created the wealth that became the United States of America, for example. And so it's so interesting because last week, everybody was talking about the Rodham story about how many people in the U.S. Congress and on the Supreme Court and how many presidents are direct descendants of enslavers, okay? And so the BBC called me and asked me to talk about it a little bit with them, which I did do. But the thing is they found that a third of the people who are in U.S. Congress today are direct descendants from enslavers. Okay, 2 of the people in the Supreme Court are direct descendants. 10 governors are direct descendants of enslavers. Every living president, except for Donald Trump, okay, but including Barack Obama through his mother's line, is a direct descendant from an enslaver. Okay, and so the power that people gain, the wealth that they gain, the position in society that they gain through ownership of Black bodies and Black families, whether they encouraged them or destroyed them, that wealth and power still persists in those families today and within our society today as well. And so the question of reparations, which is, it's going bigger and bigger. I have great doubts about whether or not it'll actually come to fruition, but nonetheless, people are talking about it. I think it's very much has to come from the perspective of what happened during the era of enslavement and afterwards, of course, but that as well. And the California legislature just published their study on reparations. It's 1,100 pages long, and there's a whole section on family and how family was impacted by slavery, as well as Jim Crow and the eras that came afterwards, and in their case for reparations too. So I think it does have a lot to do with that discussion, that discourse.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I know there are more questions in the room and we've run out of time, and I'm very sorry for those that we couldn't get around to, but I knew this would happen. I knew that we would have a lot of questions and a lot of engagement, and it has, and it really is, it really does speak to the themes and the way you've shared them with us today. And I'd like to give you a very warm and great thank you to Brenda. I'm sure you'll all want to join us.
Thank you all very, very much. That's great. Thank you. It was an honor. Thank you all very much.